The perimeter fence hummed with the familiar, drowsy static of a late afternoon fading into dusk. Cluck Norris trotted along the muddy track, his plumage still bearing the faint, iridescent sheen of server-room humidity. He carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had just dismantled a corporate empire, though in reality he was simply a rooster dragging his feet after an exhausting night of bureaucratic espionage and amphibian-adjacent water hazards. The mission parameters had been satisfied. Blackwood was gone, dissolved into a decorative koi pond by a meticulously calculated humidity overload. Cluck's objective was complete, or so the dossier in his head suggested. Henrietta stood guard at the coop entrance, her comb catching the amber light as she sifted through a pile of woven nesting straw with meticulous precision. She did not look up when Cluck approached, but her beak stopped moving entirely. The silence in the farmyard was heavy, the kind that usually preceded a veterinary inspection or a sudden thunderstorm. Henrietta plucked something from the hay with the delicate tip of her beak and tossed it onto the wooden platform where Cluck landed. It was not grain, it was not a seed. It was a sleek, matte black rectangle no larger than a peanut, woven seamlessly into the straw like an alien egg. The surface gleamed with dormant circuitry, devoid of any organic texture that a creature of Muddington Acres would ever produce. Henrietta fixed Cluck with a stare that could curdle milk and emitted a sharp, questioning cluck. To a human ear, it was merely poultry making noise. To Cluck, it was the tactical equivalent of an interrogator's flashlight in the eyes. Thermal regulation failure, his internal monologue catalogued instantly, bypassing the mundane farm reality to assess the hardware. Encrypted broadcast frequency, smart home sync tracker, model number, Blackwood Estate Security Division, Series 4. He pecked lightly at the device, feeling the faint vibration of a dormant battery. The implications were immediately clear. Lord Blackwood had anticipated failure. He had not relied on physical evidence alone. He had woven a digital tripwire into the very fabric of Cluck's sleeping quarters. A backup protocol, a ghost in the machine that would survive the owner's untimely aquatic demise. Winston materialized from behind a stack of feed bags, his snout twitching as he carried a heavily modified tablet balanced precariously on his back. The pig had spent the afternoon rigging an underground antenna network using stolen Wi-Fi extenders and chicken wire, a project he referred to as Operation Oinknet. He clacked his teeth against a key switch, projecting a stream of data onto a nearby fence, post via a makeshift projector made from a magnifying glass and a carrot lens. The coordinates scrolled across the wooden slats in jagged green text. Winston let out a low, rumbling grunt that Henrietta translated without hesitation. The pig's analysis was precise. The tracker was not dormant, it was pulsing. Every 47 seconds, it broadcasted a localized ping to a server farm registered under a roost-linked shell company. Blackwood's elimination had done nothing to sever the connection. It had merely activated the contingency. The mole within the roost had anticipated Cluck's success and left an active leash in his own home. Cluck stared at the scrolling data, his heart rate remaining perfectly steady. A professional does not panic when the scenery shifts. He simply rearranges it. The immediate threat was no longer a fraudulent businessman slipping on wet tiles. It was a digital bloodhound sniffing through the coop floorboards, waiting to lead an entire syndicate of predators straight to Muddington Acres. If the tracker remained active, their next operation would be walking into a trap set by the very organization they were supposed to dismantle. Henrietta tapped the device with her wing, then looked at Cluck, her expression demanding immediate tactical resolution. Cluck hopped down from the platform, landing softly in the dirt. He emitted a low, steady cluck, his internal voice translating the sound into a crisp operational order. The nesting straw had to be incinerated. The tracker required manual disassembly and frequency jamming before it could complete its next handshake cycle. This was no longer an extraction mission. It was a counter-surveillance sweep. The new objective was formally defined in Cluck's mind, etched over the fading daylight. Neutralize the high-tech tracking module immediately. Secure the perimeter against digital intrusion. The conspiracy had reached into their sanctuary, and Cluck Norris would not allow a piece of plastic and silicon to compromise the farm. He nudged the device toward Henrietta with his beak, his wings twitching in anticipation of Chinese letter work ahead. The game had shifted from corporate espionage to active defense, and the Bantam was ready to arrange the scenery once more. The sleek module lay exposed in the nesting straw, its metallic casing catching the pale morning light filtering through the coop slats. Cluck's beak tapped rhythmically against the wooden floor as he examined the circuitry. To an ordinary observer, it was merely a curious piece of discarded electronics. To him, it was a ticking time bomb disguised as agricultural waste. Henrietta stood watch on the lower perch, her dark eyes fixed on the device with unnerving precision. The operational partnership had forged itself overnight, born of necessity and sharpened by mutual suspicion that had finally curdled into trust. Cluck nudged a copper contact point with a careful peck. A faint hum vibrated through his claws. He tilted his head, listening to the high-pitched whine escaping the microprocessor. Henrietta shifted her weight, feathers rustling like dry parchment. She traced a line of gravel toward the device, mapping its internal pathways in her mind. The frequency was localized, tightly wound around a specific broadcast band. It did not merely record, it waited. Upon proximity to modern estate automation grids, the module would wake, hijack the control protocols, and begin broadcasting encrypted coordinates directly back to the originating server. Winston waddled into the perimeter shadow, his snout twitching as he absorbed the tension in the coop air. He carried a repurposed tablet salvaged from a broken drone frame, its cracked screen reflecting the dim interior. The pig tapped a sequence of numbers, cross-referencing signal decay. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. 500 yards, he projected. Any smart home network within that radius will automatically handshake and sync. Once it locks onto a residential hub, the module will begin routing power to trigger localized grid failures. We need a controlled isolation zone. If it touches a main distribution line, the feedback loop will fry every sensor on the acreage. Cluck absorbed the data without flinching. The professional in him recognized the elegance of the trap, a silent hunter waiting for prey to walk into its web. He paced a tight circle, calculating vectors and structural load limits. He turned toward Henrietta, his gaze steady. The signal must be drawn away from residential infrastructure. We will route it to the decommissioned agricultural stage on the boundary ridge. The steel trusses provide natural grounding, and the rusted pulley system can be repurposed as a signal funnel. With Gerald's Nord wire conduits intact, we can bridge the primary contact points and force a cascade overload. The machinery will absorb the surge. Henrietta nodded, already moving toward the coop perimeter where the weather station antenna stood mounted on a splintered fence post. She had spent years navigating the invisible current of farm life, learning which wires carried power and which merely carried gossip. She adjusted her position on the lower rail, pecking at a loose terminal to test conductivity. The weather station's receiver would serve as our remote manipulator. By shifting the carrier frequency by 12 kHz, I can invert the handshake protocol. The module will think it has achieved synchronization while actually routing its own power core into a dead loop. It requires precise timing and zero margin for error. The coop perimeter offered a natural choke point, shielding their preparations from prying eyes while maintaining line of sight to the boundary ridge. Winston remained by the tablet, his snout hovering over the cracked display as he monitored ambient radio noise for agri-shell proxy pings. His paranoia had become an asset, a constant vigilance against signals that did not belong to the soil or the sky. Cluck paced the straw once more, mapping the physical components required for the countermeasure. The decommission stage demanded heavy lifting, but farm machinery provided the leverage. A repurposed hydraulic lift from the equipment shed would position the primary contact plate. The Nord conduits needed insulation, which could be stripped from old tractor wiring. Every element existed within the existing infrastructure, only the arrangement required surgical precision. Henrietta adjusted the final coupling on the weather station antenna, securing it with a determined tug. The signal path was established. Winston logged the baseline frequency, his movements deliberate and quiet. Cluck stood at the threshold of the coop, his silhouette framed by the rising sun. The countermeasure strategy was finalized. Tech and stage equipment had been identified as key tools, transforming mundane agricultural salvage into a precision instrument of interception. The farm stirred with ordinary life outside the perimeter, completely unaware that tactical readiness had replaced routine. Cluck moved through the perimeter of Muddington Acres under the cover of a damp Tuesday night, his feathers ruffled by a breeze that carried the scent of distant diesel and expensive perfume. Beside him, Henrietta kept pace with her usual pragmatic stride, her eyes sharp behind a veil of morning dew. They had reached an understanding. At the boundary fence, Gerald was already waiting, chewing on a length of heavy-duty wire conduit with the enthusiasm of a creature who had never met a problem he couldn't solve by biting it harder. They slipped through a gap in the wrought iron fencing into the decommissioned stage area of the neighboring estate, a sprawling expanse of rotting plywood and rusted trusses that smelled of damp velvet and forgotten productions. Cluck deployed the DK heat lamp first, positioning it near a cluster of overgrown ivy. The device hummed to life, casting a warm amber glow that mimicked the thermal signature of a vulnerable power junction. Henrietta took up a position on a crumbling parapet, watching the treeline while Cluck approached the central power junction box. He pecked methodically at the rusted latches, his wings tucked tight against his body. Gerald trotted forward, dropping the gnawed wire conduits with a metallic clatter that echoed like artillery fire in the quiet night. Cluck inserted the conduits into the junction, his movements precise and deliberate. He was no ordinary rooster, he was the bantam, and tonight he was routing power to isolate a digital infection. The tracker pulsed on his breast feathers, its frequency tightening like a garrote wire. Then it locked on. The estate's smart home network shuddered into life. Lights flickered on in the abandoned manor house across the way, casting long, erratic shadows across the stage area. Automated sprinklers erupted from the overgrown flowerbeds with violent hisses. The automated irrigation system, designed for manicured lawns, now functioned as a chaotic fire hose, drenching the rotting stage floor in seconds. Above them, stage lighting rigs disengaged their safety brakes, swinging like pendulums of death through the misty air. Climate control vents, buried in the stage floor, blasted freezing air in gusts that made Cluck shiver and Henrietta ruffle her plumage in indignation. Estate security drones activated, drawn by the sudden power surge. They buzzed out of their charging cranes like angry hornets, their red sensor eyes sweeping the wet stage. Cluck dove behind a stack of velvet drapes just as a drone's spotlight swept over his position. Gerald, misinterpreting the drone buzz for an invitation to play, charged directly into a cluster of cables, tangling himself in a web of fiber optics. Henrietta clucked sharply from her vantage point. The initial isolation attempt was stalling. The smart home AI, overwhelmed by the conflicting signals and physical damage, had prioritized system lockdown over signal routing. Doors that hadn't been locked in decades slammed shut. The tracker on Cluck's chest pulsed faster, its frequency syncing not to the isolation zone, but to the estate's emergency containment protocols. Cluck pecked frantically at the junction box, trying to manually override the routing sequence, but the automated response was too fast. Water dripped from his comb as he watched the drones converge, their searchlights painting the stage in harsh white beams. He realized too late that the smart home AI was treating his intrusion as a critical security breach rather than a routine maintenance override. The original plan lay in ruins, compromised by a domestic appliance fighting for its life against a rogue microchip. He had to adapt. The Bantam did not retreat, he simply recalculated the angle of approach. The stage area was transforming into a chaotic theater of malfunctioning technology. Cluck adjusted his footing on the slick plywood, eyes locked on the swaying lights and the buzzing drones. The mission had shifted from surgical precision to survival instinct. He would need to use the chaos, not fight it. But as the cold wind bit through his feathers and the tracker's frequency grew louder, Cluck knew that the estate was no longer a passive target. It was awake, and it was fighting back. The decommissioned stage groaned under the weight of automated malice, the floorboards vibrating with the hum of overworked servos. Cluck Norris froze, his claws gripping the splintered wood as the smart home AI, interpreting his calculated approach not as stealth, but as a catastrophic security breach, engaged its defense protocols with spectacular overreaction. Above him, the darkness fractured into geometric shadows. Heavy steel trusses detached from their moorings, groaning like dying leviathans, and began a slow, grinding descent directly toward his position. The motion was fluid, precise, and utterly lethal. Simultaneously, the tracking module woven deep within the nesting straw of his coat tail emitted a sharp digital chirp that Cluck perceived as a high-pitched insect whine. The AI's erratic power surges were scrambling the Faraday cage Henrietta had laboriously woven into the Coop antenna. The tracker's frequency shifted, latching onto the estate's chaotic grid with predatory hunger and beginning to broadcast his location with renewed vigor. Cluck ruffled his feathers, sending a burst of static charge toward the perimeter fence where Henrietta waited in the shadow of the run. A sharp cluck answered, followed by the distant hum of the Coop's modified antenna spinning up, grinding against its bearings. The signal jamming wave hit the tracker instantly, but the feedback loop was immediate and violent. The interference caused the estate's rigging controls to over-rotate, snapping the descent into a violent lurch. The trusses swung like pendulum blades of death, scything through the air with a whistle that promised bone-shattering impact, threatening to pin the assassin against the rotting floorboards. A professional arranges the scenery, but sometimes the scenery decides to arrange you. Cluck noted this dry observation even as his heart rate spiked. The geometry was wrong. The trusses were no longer a threat to be avoided. They were a variable to be exploited. He watched the arc of the nearest iron beam, calculating the blind spot beneath its swing. It would have to do. The geometry demanded sacrifice of comfort for survival. The original protocol for isolation was ash in his beak. Cluck dropped into a crouch, abandoning the delicate isolation plan in favor of improvisation. As a rusted counterweight swung down, he scrambled beneath it, using the swaying mass as a shield from the estate's sweeping sensor arrays that were now painting the room with angry red lasers. He needed leverage, and he needed it before the coolant lines froze solid. From the shadows of the prop storage, Gerald emerged, eyes wide with manic enthusiasm, drawn by the scent of exposed wiring and the general panic in the air. The goat lunged, teeth scything through a thick hydraulic hose with a satisfying crunch that echoed like a gunshot. Instead of spraying pressurized water, a geyser of viscous, chemical coolant erupted, flooding the stage floor in seconds. The liquid was the color of bruised plums and smelled faintly of ozone and synthetic regret. Cluck assessed the pool with professional detachment. He waddled to the edge, peering down at the spreading slick. The coolant was rich in ionic salts, a conductor par excellence, far superior to the conductive mud Henrietta usually suggested. He watched as the liquid crept toward the exposed power junction box beneath the stage, moving with the inevitability of a rising tide. Finally, it licked the tracker's external nodes, bridging the gap with a visible arc of blue sparks. The connection was made. A conductive bridge formed between the high-voltage grid and the tracking module's sensitive circuitry. He paused, tilting his head to listen to the hum of the junction box. The frequency was stabilizing into a feedback loop. If he pulled back now, the surge would likely destroy the tracker but leave the estate intact. If he waited 3 seconds longer, the heat buildup would cascade backward, frying the module and scrambling the local grid permanently. It was a risk. A professional calculated such variables in milliseconds. Cluck stepped closer to the pool, his claws testing the conductivity of the wooden deck. The thermal rise was palpable, a warning heat that prickled his skin. He made his choice. The original isolation protocol lay in ruins, discarded like a worn-out script. Yet the plan had reversed, and the result remained identical. Malfunction repurposed. Neutralization pathway open. The air on the decommissioned stage still tasted of ozone and panic. The heavy trusses that had threatened to crush Cluck Norris into a fine, feathered mist groaned and settled, caught by the sudden, catastrophic failure of the estate's hydraulic pressure system. It was a fortunate accident, born from the smart home's own overzealous security protocols. In the dim light filtering through shattered skylights, dust motes danced like suspended secrets. Now suspended precariously atop a rusted lighting rig, the rooster adjusted his comb with a practiced flick of his beak. The tracker module, previously hidden within his nesting straw back at Muddington Acres, lay exposed and pulsing with an angry crimson light on the wet stage floor below. It was a sleek, non-farm surveillance device, utterly out of place amidst the rotting velvet curtains and peeling paint of the country estate's forgotten auditorium. Cluck's internal monologue ran cold and precise, cutting through the ambient hum of malfunctioning machinery. The estate's artificial intelligence had tried to interpret his presence as a catastrophic breach, deploying heavy countermeasures that only served to dismantle its own defenses. The game has shifted, he thought, eyes narrowing as they tracked the erratic dance of the tracker's signal waves. The mole within the roost anticipated my arrival. They expected a standard extraction, not a symphony of cascading failures. But Cluck did not deal in expectations. He dealt in arrangements, and today the scenery was already set for him. He dropped from the rigging, landing silently on a stack of damp stage flats. The hydraulic line, stripped bare by the earlier cascade of malfunctions, hissed like a cornered serpent. Thick, milky fluid leaked with relentless persistence, coating the wood in a slick, conductive sheen. Cluck scanned the immediate vicinity with predatory patience. There, mounted to a water-stained pillar, was an irrigation timer, cobbled together from mismatched parts and decades of neglect. It was analog, stubborn, and entirely independent of the estate's digital nervous system. Perfect. With swift, deliberate movements, Cluck hopped onto a wooden crate and pecked at the timer's dial. His beak clicked against the metal casing as he routed the manual override switch. The mechanism resisted, but with a sharp, metallic snap, it gave way. A heavy valve turned, and the flow of coolant from the hydraulic line diverted entirely into the irrigation system's main junction box. The tracker module on the floor suddenly flared brighter, its frequency spiking as it attempted to recalibrate and re-establish contact with its remote servers. It emitted a high-pitched whine, a digital scream as it frantically searched for an open channel to its handlers. Cluck watched calmly. The coolant was no longer contained. It spilled across the floorboards, seeking the path of least resistance, until it reached the open circuitry of the power junction beneath the stage's control booth. Here came the moment of truth. The conductive fluid bridged the gap between the smart home hub's residual voltage and the tracker's exposed microcomponents. For a fraction of a second, the air crackled with blue sparks. Then came the cascade. A harmless but decisive short circuit rippled through the device. The crimson light flickered, sputtered, and died entirely. The tracker module went dark, its encryption patterns fried beyond recovery. Cluck hopped down to the floor, pecking gently at the now inert surveillance unit until it clicked loose from a tangled wire. He retrieved it, tucking it safely against his breast feathers. The metallic casing was warm to the touch. Neutralized, he noted internally. The immediate threat is contained. However, the roost-linked encryption pattern remains visible on the outer casing, glowing faintly even in death. A deliberate leak, carefully orchestrated by a traitor within our own ranks. The confirmations strung, but there was no time for regret. Operational security required forward momentum. The formal objective was complete. The tracker module lay dead at his feet, the immediate tech threat resolved. Cluck turned toward the stage exit, his silhouette framed against the gloom of the estate's boundary. He would return to Muddington Acres shortly. Henrietta would be awaiting his report, and Winston would have new coordinates to decode. For now, the conspiracy could wait. The farm required him. The sunrise was approaching, and ordinary roosters had strict duties to attend to before the first contract of the day finally arrived. Cluck clattered the charred module across the straw, the casing still radiating the heat of 1,000 volts and one very specific hydraulic short circuit. To the untrained eye, it was merely debris from a smart home disaster, But to Henrietta, who stood with wings akimbo near the nesting box, it was the end of a surveillance threat. "You routed the coolant through the irrigation timer," she clucked, her tone sharp with approval as she peered at the fried circuitry. "A brilliant, if utterly chaotic, application of physics." Cluck preened a wing feather with deliberate nonchalance, though his internal monologue hummed with satisfaction. The scenery had been arranged perfectly. The coolant surge bridged the gap between the estate's arrogance and my precision. He pecked at a stray grain of feed near her talons, the gesture masking the fact that he was mentally cataloguing every hydraulic pressure point in the district. "Chaos is just physics waiting for an operator," he clucked back. The translation in Henrietta's head was immediate, her head tilted. "Agreed. Our coordination needs refinement on the frequency dampening, but the structural damage to their grid is total." From the far end of the run, where a tangle of roots offered optimal signal reception, Winston the pig emerged from the shadows of a manure heap. His snout was plugged, with a shard of bamboo acting as a makeshift earpiece connected to a jury-rigged receiver buried beneath the compost pile. "The static has cleared," Winston grunted, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the dirt. The module's local memory held a backup burst before the cascade fried the core. "I've just pulled the packet." Henrietta stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "What does it say?" "Agri-shell is accelerating," Winston replied, chewing the bamboo stub rhythmically as data scrolled across his mind's eye. "The proxy directors are moving faster than predicted. They've secured options on a logistics hub in Docklands and 3 residential estates near Canary Wharf under shell companies registered yesterday. The coordinates match the leak pattern." Cluck froze mid-peck, a piece of cracked corn suspended in his beak. London. The realization hit him with the force of a rogue tractor. The conspiracy wasn't just local. The farm was merely the testing ground for a broader encroachment. Agri-Shell was using the farm as a beachhead to swallow the city's periphery, masking their expansion behind layers of legal fiction and surveillance tech. "The mole is active," Cluck clucked, his voice dropping an octave. The humans nearby would hear only a concerned rooster warning of a fox, but Henrietta caught the subtext instantly. "We have work to do," Henrietta clucked, her posture shifting from observer to operational partner. "If they are moving into London, the roost needs to know. But first, we secure our perimeter." Cluck nodded, a subtle dip of his red comb. The partnership had evolved. No longer just a hen watching a rooster, they were now cells in a single organism. He clucked softly, a sound that conveyed absolute readiness. "London Shell directors, Agri-Shell proxies. The game has expanded, but the rules remain the same. Arrange the scenery, eliminate the threat." Winston shifted his weight, the receiver whirring faintly as he adjusted the gain. "There's more." A secondary burst just pinged off the module's dead battery, encrypted traffic pointing to a director in Kensington. The encryption key matches the one used in the farm breach. Henrietta ruffled her feathers, a gesture of grim determination. "Kensington, we have a target vector." Cluck looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to bleed orange over the Muddington Acres fields. The immediate threat at Blackwood's estate was neutralized, but the war for his home had just moved to the concrete jungle. He turned back to his allies, his gaze hard. "Preparation begins now. Gerald will require a new disguise anyway. His chewing habits are becoming a liability on high-tech ops." Winston snorted. "I've already noted the structural weaknesses in Kensington's smart grid infrastructure. We'll need the Faraday weave from the Coop antenna." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the farm animals resuming their routine around them, Henrietta's sisters scratching at the dirt, the distant lowing of cows, but the air between the trio crackled with silent purpose. The tracker was gone, the evidence was secured, and the path to London was now illuminated by the cold fire of intelligence. Cluck let out a sharp crow, not for the dawn, but as a signal to the underground network that would never know he existed. "The Bantam is mobilizing." As Henrietta and Winston turned toward their respective comms stations, Cluck's internal monologue settled into its familiar rhythm of calculation and cold resolve. The countryside was safe. Now it was time to teach the city a thing or two about farm security.